Thanks for joining us for our next installment of our small group study. We're going to be talking about the book of Psalms today. So, Chad, would you go ahead and read for us?
Psalm chapter 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify him in his fury, saying, As for me, I have set my king on Zion, on my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him.
All right, so as we're looking at the Psalms, I think it's appropriate to understand, first of all, why we're placing the Psalms here in the timeline. And, we've just recently talked about the kingship of Saul and the kingship of David. And really, we're looking at the Psalms not only because David is the writer of many of the Psalms, but because of the function of the book of Psalms within the Scripture itself. So, when you were growing up as a Christian, you were reading the book of Psalms. How did you view it? What did you think of it?
I didn't view it as a connected whole. I will say that is, but it's a lot of individually distinct things that some days showed David on a good day and David on a bad day, or
Right.
or other authors and things of this sort. But I really viewed each psalm as kind of a standalone and not a piece of a whole.
Yeah, I think that's really a common way of viewing the Psalms, and I think that most of the times when we read through the book of Psalms, it's not clear or obvious what relationship they have to one another, and really what the structure of the whole book is. But it's important for us to understand that there is a structure to the book of Psalms. It's got two Psalms that kind of open it up, and then there's 5 books of Psalms. That are divided into books, and then there's finally a few psalms at the end that kind of wrap it up, and so there's this overall structure of the book, and the reason that that's important to us is because the book of Psalms functions like a new Torah, and when we say like a new Torah, there's a reason that Israel, at the time that David comes on the scene, there's a reason that they need a new Torah. And that has to do with the fact that the old covenant in large part is dead and there's a new covenant being formed. And so when you've heard in the past as a Christian of the Davidic covenant, what comes to mind when we say Davidic covenant?
Obviously, the reign of David and his sons, but extending all the way to the Messiah as well. And but it's God said, you and one of your sons will always sit on the throne, kind of sort of.
Right. And it's not always clear to us, I think, when we're growing up as Christians, how the Davidic covenant fits in with the covenant at Sinai. And it kind of seems like a kind of a very limited covenant. It's just about who's going to be king. But really, there's much more going on than that. And when we have the Davidic covenant, we have basically the death of the Sinai covenant to a large extent. If you recall, the Sinai covenant was a covenant that God gave to the people, and they were supposed to be faithful to that covenant and obey that covenant. And each one of them were kind of treated as their own kings. God was their ultimate king, but each one was to be kind of a king and priest. But what happens throughout the book of Judges is that there is a problem, and that problem is that there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as they saw fit. And then finally we get a situation where Israel's clamoring for a king, and God says to the prophet, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. There's a rejection of the old covenant that takes place. And so in this new covenant, there's going to be an issue of federal headship that takes place. Now, have you ever heard of the term federal headship?
Yeah, we talk about in terms of both Adam and Christ, this federal headship that they kind of as the representative of all humanity, are either imparting sin to all humanity or imparting, righteousness to all humanity.
Yeah, yeah. And so the idea is that federal headship is a situation where somebody represents us. And so it's not us that are the issue, it's the person who represents us. So if you go into a courtroom, you might never take the stand if you're being charged with a crime. You might never say anything other than if you're pleading guilty or innocent. After that, who's going to be representing you?
Your attorney.
Yeah, your attorney's going to be the one who's speaking for you, and he's speaking for you, and you've placed in him your trust. And if at the end of that court proceeding you don't like the job that he did, you can't say wait, that doesn't count, right? You've elected to have him speak for you, and so he's speaking for you. It's not you. It's really he's speaking for you. And in that way, that's what happens when Israel rejects the covenant that God gave them and asks for a king. What they're really asking for is somebody to represent them. And so the new Davidic covenant is going to be a covenant where the king is going to represent the people before God. And so the king has a book of the law. The king studies that law day and night. The king's doing all of that stuff. And why, if you think about it, God didn't want them to, that wasn't the plan. The original plan wasn't for them to have a king. Why would God allow them to have a king given the nature of the change in the covenant?
Well, obviously they wanted them in, excuse me, we've spoken, sometimes, God will give you what you want in order to kind of dethrone that idea in your own mind. Could be one reason. But also, obviously this idea of having one representative has the potential to be a good thing because then one guy has to get it right. But it also has the potential to be a very bad thing because only one guy has to get it wrong then as well.
Right.
And obviously in Jesus in the future, we have this messianic outlook that someday one guy is going to get it right. But up until that point, there's no one guy who ever really gets it completely right.
Right. And so what we have is a progression as God is revealing himself throughout Scripture and trying to have a relationship with mankind. That relationship is one where God directs and the people obey. That's just the nature of the spirit to the flesh, is that the Spirit directs us, he commands us, if you want to use that word, he guides us, and then the Spirit obeys. And what happens is when God sets up that kind of relationship with the people, they don't want to have that relationship. They don't like the responsibility of that, and so they're going to say, well, we can't be obedient. We can't keep the covenant. We can't do these things. We'll choose a guy that will do it for us, and that's what they're going to do with the king. And the problem is that the king is not going to be able to do any better job than they have. Because he's just a person. But they have to go through this, and they have to see that it doesn't work. And the reason they have to see that it doesn't work is because God's going to provide a king that is not merely human as the ultimate way of solving this problem. There will be federal headship, but it will be in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, not in an ordinary human being. Does it make any difference to the way that you read the Psalms, understanding that they're not just a group of random songs or poems?
Oh, absolutely. It's funny. I've often heard, not just the Psalms, but in general, you'll hear somebody kind of take a big step back and take an overview of the entire book of Matthew, and you're like, oh, I never kind of put those things together like that, And the same thing in the Psalms, and ultimately, unfortunately, I made the mistake, and I don't know if we'll call it a mistake, but when I've read through the Psalms, my goal has been to get through them in a month, and so I'll read Psalm 1, and then 31, 61, 91, 121, and so seeing that, that unfortunately has made it very difficult for me to see this coherency within each of the 5 books.
Yeah, and it's not something that's easy to pick up on. In fact, there's a lot of reading and studying you have to do to really see the themes play out within each of the books. And this connection between the book of the Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, and the 5 books of the Psalms is one that's not, it's not just one for one. It's not that the first one equals Genesis and so on and so forth. That there's a difference in themes and a difference in what's happening in this new covenant, and so they don't line up that way. But it is, I think, instructive for us because really what's happening here in this book of Psalms is that the people are struggling with their failure and they're reaching out for somebody to save them. And, who of us isn't in that position? And so the Psalms have been something that have brought great comfort to Christians for thousands of years.